Throughout the entire history of aviation, hundreds of civilian aircraft have been hijacked. Only in one case, however, did the hijacking turn into one of the major mysteries of the 20th century. The criminal did not just disappear. Nobody knows who this person was, even 50 years later. All we have is a composite sketch and a fictitious name. You have likely heard the name D.B. Cooper. Some are even aware of the details, but the story itself does not cease to be astonishing. November 1971, United States. A man over 40, dressed in a business suit, tie and dark glasses, boards a passenger aircraft. Immediately after takeoff, he informs the stewardess that there is a bomb in his suitcase and that the aircraft has been hijacked. The perpetrator has several demands, the main ones being parachutes and $200,000. The plane lands, the hijacker's demands are met, and the aircraft takes off again, heading for Mexico. Somewhere along the way, the perpetrator takes a bag of money, opens the cabin door, and jumps into the darkness with a parachute. If the hijacker had been found alive or dead in the days, months, or even years that followed, the story would have remained only in the FBI archives. But first, there was a large-scale search operation involving special services, the military, and police. Then the FBI investigated the case for several decades. Eventually, amateur detectives from the internet got involved. The number of potential suspects is over 1,000, with even more potential witnesses. Despite this, to this day, no one can confidently answer the three main questions. How did the hijacker organize the operation? Where did he disappear to? And finally, who was this D.B. Cooper? Some stories have an amazing quality. The more you dive into them, the more facts, details, and documents you study, the more confusing yet intriguing they become. The disappearance of D.B. Cooper is one such story. This case engages people worldwide, but in America, it truly has a cult status. Finding D.B. Cooper is almost like finding Atlantis, that is, securing a place in history. Well then, let's give it a try. And we'll start with what happened during the flight, because we know almost nothing about what happened before, and even less about what happened afterward. However, what we do know quite well is what occurred inside the aircraft. Let's concentrate on this as meticulously as possible. After all, it is precisely this that will help us answer many questions. November 24th, 1971, the eve of Thanksgiving, one of the major holidays of the year. Portland Airport, boarding is announced for Northwest Airlines flight number 305 to Seattle. The aircraft is scheduled to depart around 3 in the afternoon. Passengers board through the rear door, as this is the design of the Boeing 727 model. The stewardess greets passengers and checks tickets. The cabin has 18 rows of seats, 3 on each side. The flight will be half empty with fewer than 40 passengers. One of the last to board is a man in a black raincoat, black suit, and carrying a briefcase. The stewardess looks at the ticket. The name of the passenger is Dan Cooper. He enters the cabin and sits in the last row on the right. He places a briefcase on the empty seat by the window. In the same row, but to the left of the aisle, sit 2 passengers. They do not yet know that they will soon become important witnesses. The airplane is almost ready for takeoff. The stewardess who checked the tickets is named Florence Schaffner. She is one of the 3 flight attendants on board, primarily responsible for serving passengers at the rear of the cabin. At that moment, Dan Cooper does not arouse suspicion. He is not wearing dark glasses, and a dark business suit is typical attire for an air passenger of that time. Most of them fly for business. Florence asks Cooper what he would like to drink. He orders a bourbon and 7-Up. The airplane begins to taxi to the runway. 2 stewardesses take their positions at service seats at the back of the cabin. The Boeing accelerates. At the moment when it is almost airborne, Florence turns at Cooper's request. He hands her a note. She puts it in her bag to read later. However, Cooper says, "Miss, you'd better read this now." Florence opens the note. It reads, "Miss, I have a bomb. Please sit next to me." The stewardess initially asks if this is a joke. Upon hearing a negative response, she sits in the empty seat to Cooper's left. He opens the briefcase. Florence notices red sticks resembling dynamite, a battery, and a piece of exposed wire which the perpetrator holds. The stewardess passes the note to her colleague named Tina Mucklow. Florence's face tells her that the situation is serious. Tina immediately contacts the cockpit by phone. The airplane is hijacked. There is a bomb, and this is no joke, she reports. At this moment, the plane is steadily gaining altitude, so the airplane takes off. It's important to understand what type of airplane this is and where it is headed. The airplane is departing from Portland and bound for Seattle. These two cities are located a short distance from each other. The entire flight takes approximately half an hour. The flight attendants hardly have time to distribute ordered drinks and magazines to the passengers. Another important detail is the model of the airplane that Cooper and the other passengers are flying on. Boeing 727. It can accommodate more than 100 passengers, all of whom enter the cabin from the rear. There is a door there, which also functions as a staircase. It opens and closes with a special lever. The stewardesses manage the door, but theoretically anyone could do it. This design allows the Boeing to land and pick up passengers even in very small towns and airports. There is no need to pull up to a terminal. That is how it was that day, November 24th, 1971. The plane had already made several flights, and Portland to Seattle was the final flight for the 3 flight attendants and the 3 Boeing pilots before a long weekend. Upon receiving the message from the stewardess about the man with a bomb, the pilots report the situation to the dispatcher. For now, they do not know how to act because they are unaware of what the hijacker wants. But this uncertainty will not last long. Cooper puts on dark sunglasses. Florence Schaffner will no longer be able to see his eyes. Other witnesses will remember the criminal only with glasses. Cooper asks the stewardess to write down a list of demands. She hands them to the pilots, who in turn communicate them to the dispatchers. The transcription of the communication between the pilots and dispatchers has been preserved almost verbatim. Here is how they relayed Cooper's demands. By 5 o'clock, $200,000 in cash in a backpack, 2 main parachutes, and 2 reserve parachutes must be ready. The money must be in current American currency. In his suitcase is a bomb, and he will use it if the demands are not met. Cooper also insists that a fuel truck be ready to refuel the plane and food for the crew, because afterward they will embark on a short journey. In the end, he adds, no jokes. By that time, Florence Schaffner had gone to deliver the note with the demands to the pilot's cabin, and since Cooper wanted one of the flight attendants to stay with him, the second stewardess, Tina Mucklow, sat next to him. She is the one who will ultimately spend the most time next to Cooper. Cooper's demands are transmitted to the ground, and the FBI immediately gets involved. An officer from the Special Services in Portland, after receiving information about the hijacker, initially thinks it's an imitator. Just 10 days before, a passenger in a Canadian airline had also hijacked a plane under threat of explosion. That person demanded $1.5 million, allegedly for the needs of Irish separatists. In the end, he agreed to just $50,000. The aircraft was also similar in construction with a door at the back. Before the hijacker could jump with a parachute, he was incapacitated by one of the passengers. The story, of course, made it to the press. Whether Cooper heard about it or not is naturally unknown, but it is clear that the very idea of hijacking a plane for ransom was not something exclusive. As I have already noted, we know well what happened during the flight, not only in the air but also on the ground. And the situation was extremely interesting, so, on the airplane, Cooper with a bomb and a list of demands. Only the crew knows that the aircraft has been hijacked. The passengers are not aware of what is happening. One of them, who was sitting in the same row but across the aisle, later recounted that the situation seemed a bit strange to him, primarily because the stewardess sat with a man in dark glasses for a long time, but he knew nothing about a bomb or demands. On the ground, the FBI and airline management are trying to figure out what to do. They could refuse to meet the demands and attempt to storm the plane, but then the passengers would be at risk. A similar incident happened literally a month before with a small plane in the Bahamas. The authorities refused to refuel the plane. As a result, shooting ensued, during which part of the crew was fatally wounded. The president of the airline Northwest negotiates with a bank to provide $200,000 in cash. And the main concern of the authorities is to prepare the parachutes and fuel. There is not much time for all of this. The flight is very short. Cooper is still seated next to the stewardess, Tina. He is smoking actively, asking her about who she is and where she is from. Tina notes that the hijacker is polite and not aggressive. The plane gradually begins circling around the vicinity of Seattle. Looking out the window, Cooper notes that they are now over Tacoma. It's a small town nearby. The weather is gradually deteriorating, with storm clouds visible from the windows. Due to the delay, the pilots decide to tell the passengers that they have a minor technical issue and need to circle in the sky over the airport for a while to dump excess fuel. This is, of course, not quite what you want to hear while sitting on a plane miles above the ground, but it's better than finding out that the aircraft has been hijacked by a man with a bomb. The FBI on the ground is hurrying. Not only do they need to collect $200,000 and deliver it to the airport, but they also need to record the serial numbers of each bill so they can be tracked later. Parachutes are also not immediately available. 2 spare ones are still on their way to the airport. Cooper says they can start landing and wait for them on the ground. Tina Mucklow asks the hijacker whether he harbors any animosity toward the Northwest Airlines, to which Cooper replies, "Miss, I don't have animosity toward your airline, I just have animosity." This quote, like many others, would later be meticulously analysed to understand the criminal's true motives, but we will return to this a bit later. Shortly before landing, Cooper starts to get nervous. He suspects that the delay is due to the FBI preparing a special operation and not planning to take him alive. His concerns are quite justified. The airport is completely closed for landing and takeoff. Snipers are positioned on the rooftops, and even the president of Northwest Airlines doesn't know what the FBI plans to do. Finally, the plane lands. FBI agents see the heads of passengers through the windows. At this moment, Cooper is in the restroom. Passengers stand up from their seats and begin gathering their luggage. A mobile stairway approaches the front door of the plane. Cooper exits the restroom. According to the recollections of one passenger, besides the briefcase, he also has a bag. What is in it is unknown. As per the criminal's demands, Tina Mucklow is the first to disembark from the airplane to bring the money. For the authorities, this moment is the last chance to begin the assault, but they decide to comply with the hijacker's demands. Eventually, the stewardess comes on board. She has a bag with the money in her hands. She hands it to Cooper, who quickly inspects the contents. These are bundles of bills. "Looks correct," the hijacker says. He agrees to release the passengers. They descend onto the dark airstrip, still not understanding what actually happened. Cooper also releases 2 of the stewardesses. 3 pilots and Tina Mucklow remain with him. She descends for the parachutes, 2 of which were brought at the very last moment. Afterward, Cooper asks the stewardess to close all the window shades in the cabin. Upon her return, Tina discovers the culprit cutting the ropes off one of the spare front parachutes with a knife. Cooper is displeased that the money was not brought in a knapsack. Therefore, he tries to stuff it into a parachute bag, but it is too small. Moreover, the refueling of the plane is delayed, which also makes Cooper nervous. Communication between the hijacker and the pilots goes through the flight attendant, Mucklow. It is to her that he relays the following demand. "We are flying to Mexico City or any other place in Mexico. The flight altitude must not exceed 10,000 feet. The rear door is to be lowered, the landing gear extended, the flaps lowered to 15 degrees. The cabin lights are to be turned off. After takeoff, everyone, including Tina, is to be in the front section of the aircraft. The curtains separating the first-class passenger seats must be closed. Refueling can happen anywhere in Mexico, but not on United States territory." A psychiatrist from the Federal Aviation Administration, along with the FBI, is monitoring the actions and demands of the hijacker. He is convinced that the 2 additional parachutes are needed by Cooper to jump with a crew member and subsequently blow up the plane. In the bus that picked up Flight 305 passengers from the runway, a roll call takes place. Only one name remains unresponded to: Dan Cooper. For the FBI agents, this is no surprise. While the plane was in the air, they interviewed the airline employee who sold the tickets for the flight. She recalled a suspicious man over 40 with dark skin wearing a black suit and tie. His name, Dan Cooper. When the passengers of Flight 305 are finally brought to the airport, they witness an unusual scene. Commotion, cameras, and a vast number of journalists who, unlike the passengers, have long been aware of the hijacked plane. It is only through press inquiries that those on board the Boeing are able to fully understand what actually happened. Another significant moment occurs at the airport. One of the journalists asks an FBI agent if they have a name for the suspect. The agent responds, "Yes, D. Cooper." He simply stated the initial of the name, D for Dan. The journalist, not hearing clearly, asks, "DB Cooper?" Amidst the hustle, the agent responds, "Yes," and at that moment a legend is born. Due to a mistake, many journalists will start referring to the suspect as DB Cooper. And this is the name that will remain in history. Based on the hijackers' demands, the FBI agents understand the following: a flight altitude of 10,000 feet. This is quite low. If they go higher, the cabin will be pressurized, and an open cabin door spells a death sentence for those inside. However, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, this won't happen. It is apparent that Cooper knows something about aircraft design. Yet his knowledge is insufficient to realize that although a plane can fly with an open rear door, it cannot take off in that manner. Hence, the door will have to be opened once airborne. Furthermore, with the landing gear and flaps extended, the Boeing flies very slowly, and the fuel consumption is enormous, which means there won't be enough to reach Mexico. When planning their route, the pilots decide to make their first stop in the city of Reno. The flight attendant gives Cooper instructions for the parachutes, to which he replies that he does not need them. Before sending Tina to the front part of the airplane, Cooper asks her to show him how to open the rear door. The flight attendant asks what he will do with the bomb. Cooper replies that he will either take it with him or disarm it. After this, he sends her to the front part of the plane where the first-class section is and asks her to close the curtain behind her. Tina Mucklow observes Cooper trying to tie a bag of money to his body using ropes. Afterwards, she closes the curtain. The Boeing takes off. What happened with Cooper on the plane before the jump can be reconstructed with some level of accuracy, though not with absolute certainty. What we know thoroughly are the actions of the authorities and the crew of the aircraft at the same time. The Boeing's route passes near Portland, from where they initially took off. This means the Boeing is effectively moving in the reverse direction. Whether they will reach Reno or not, the pilots do not know. It all depends on Cooper and his demands. The weather conditions are generally not bad. There is a light rain and the cloud ceiling is below 1 kilometer. It is already dark, and it is around 8 in the evening. The FBI decides to send 2 interceptor jets and a couple of helicopters to follow the Boeing. Several more combat aircraft will take to the sky later. However, the helicopters fly too slowly, even despite the low speed of the Boeing, which is still a jet aircraft. Conversely, the jets fly too fast and significantly higher, which causes Cooper's aircraft to constantly disappear from their radar, forcing them to just fly back and forth. It is important to understand that the main goal of the fighters is not Cooper. They are needed to shoot down the Boeing if the pilots lose control and the aircraft heads toward a populated area. About 20 kilometers away from Seattle, the pilots notice a signal in the cabin. It indicates that the rear door has been lowered. At this point, it becomes so windy and noisy in the fuselage, it feels as though a tornado is occurring inside. The pilots are unable to see the interior temperature, but according to the gauges, it is -7 degrees outside. The pilots try to communicate with Cooper, asking if he needs any assistance. He replies that he does not. After some more time, they notice a sharp pressure drop and some turbulence of the aircraft. Whether this is related to the hijacker having jumped or not is still unclear. They attempt to contact Cooper again. This time there is no response. The pilots need to inform the hijacker that they are preparing to land and that the rear door must be closed, otherwise it will be damaged upon landing and the aircraft will be inoperable. There is no reaction from Cooper. The Boeing lands in Reno. The captain exits the cockpit, walks through the first-class cabin and draws back the curtain. There is no one there. Dan Cooper immediately became a myth, one of the main enigmas of the 20th century. After the flight attendant closed the curtain, leaving the hijacker alone at the end of the moving airplane, no one saw him again. neither alive nor dead. Moreover, until now, no one has been able to establish his true identity. Could Cooper have survived the jump with a parachute under such conditions? If not, why was the body, parachute or money never found? If he did survive, how could he have hidden for half a century? There are numerous questions, but let's take it step by step. The next day, November 25, 1971, a large-scale search operation began. According to various sources, it involved anywhere from hundreds to 1,000 police officers, military personnel and FBI agents. Airplanes conducted aerial reconnaissance, and boats combed through bodies of water. Every participant coordinated their efforts with one another. Searching for Cooper along the entire route from Seattle to Reno is an impossible task. The distance is vast, and no amount of manpower would suffice. Therefore, one of the main tasks for investigators became the following: to determine the exact time Cooper made the jump, down to the minute. In any other criminal case, this would not be as crucial. But here we are dealing with a jet Boeing. Even its slowest speed amounts to several hundred kilometers per hour. According to instrument readings, the rear door was opened at 7:42. At 8:12, the well-known pressure change and aircraft oscillation occurred. Could this have been the result of the jump? For this, we need a bit of mathematics and physics. How much did Cooper and his load weigh? According to interviews with many witnesses, the hijacker was over 180 centimeters tall, neither very thin nor very heavy. Let's assume 80 kilograms. The next question is the weight of the money. Cooper received the entire sum in $20 bills. Simple calculations show that $200,000 is 10,000 bills. The banknotes were sealed. This means the bag was not only large but also heavy, about 10 kilograms. The parachute weighed about the same, so approximately 100 kilograms were jumping from the plane. Due to strong air currents, the rear ramp did not fully open during flight. It essentially hung along with the man who intended to jump. Could a non-professional dare to attempt such a thing? Unlikely. Nevertheless, engineers from Northwest Airlines believed that Cooper's jump could have caused the pressure change and aircraft oscillations. Considering the speed of the Boeing and its route, the FBI estimated where Cooper roughly jumped. The search area covered more than 100 square kilometers. Computer calculations reduced it to 60 square kilometers. Let's look at the map again. According to the FBI, Cooper's jump and landing occurred in this area slightly short of Portland, where Cooper originally boarded the Boeing. The theory that the hijacker landed here would later be disputed by some researchers due to new evidence. However, both then, in 1971 and up to the present, the FBI maintains the theory that Cooper landed in this sector. Part of this territory consists of impenetrable forests, and all this in an area where by the end of November snow already begins to fall, and the weather is generally foul, further complicating the search efforts. In addition to hundreds of government representatives, Cooper is being sought on the ground by enthusiasts. Many of them primarily hope to find not the hijacker, but the $200,000. However, by that time the authorities had already publicly released the serial numbers of all the bills, meaning it would be unlikely to use the money, but there is a chance to receive $25,000 as a reward from the airline. To make the numbers less abstract, allow me to explain. When converted to today's currency, $200,000 would be more than $1 million. Accordingly, the reward is approximately a tenth of that. The authorities desire to find Cooper as quickly as possible. There are two reasons for this. With the onset of winter, it will likely be necessary to suspend the search for several months, simply because the weather will not permit. Secondly, the longer Cooper remains at large, the greater the chances of copycats emerging. The story is being actively discussed in the press, and there will undoubtedly be those wishing to earn money in a similar manner, and, spoiler alert, they will appear. Besides the physical searches on the ground, the FBI is working with evidence and witnesses. The primary function of the latter is to describe in detail what Cooper looked like, so that experts can create a facial composite. The very first sketch of Cooper, based on the testimony of one of the passengers, turns out as follows. Potentially, hundreds of thousands of people could match this description. The situation is further complicated by the fact that many passengers' testimonies differ significantly from one another. Some say the man's age is approximately 35 years. Others are sure he is older than 50. The main problem is that all witnesses saw Cooper wearing glasses, except for one, flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Her testimony, along with that of her colleague Tina Mucklow, becomes the basis for the most famous sketch of Cooper. According to Florence's recollections, Cooper's eyes were brown, his hair dark, his age about 40 years, slightly over 180 centimeters tall, with a black suit and shoes. Her colleague Tina generally agrees, but with some adjustments. In her opinion, his height is slightly less, and the shoes are brown. Nonetheless, we get a more or less complete portrait of the hijacker. Another direction of the FBI's work is evidence. Immediately after landing, they search the plane. First and foremost are the fingerprints. Armrests, the lavatory door, the telephone receiver with which Cooper communicated with the pilots. There are a vast number of fingerprints, wonderful, in theory. In reality, there's little use for these fingerprints. It's unclear which belong to Cooper, which to the crew members, which to other passengers, and which to passengers of other Boeing flights that same day. The next important piece of evidence is the cigarette butts. The ashtray is located in the armrest. During the flight, Cooper smoked actively. The investigators have 8 cigarette butts at their disposal, a splendid piece of evidence. Each contains a heap of saliva. In this saliva, there is DNA material. The case is almost solved, presumably. This is the early 70s. It will be a couple of decades before DNA testing begins to solve crimes. On the seat where Cooper sat, experts found a couple of hairs. One of them is from the head. It is brown in color, and based on the analysis results, belongs to a person with white skin. Whose hair is it? It is unclear. Nearby is a narrow black tie with a gold clip in the middle. It is a cheap model of a tie that is not tied, but simply clipped to the neck. Does the tie belong to Cooper? Possibly. Most likely. But it's not a fact. And of course, among the evidence, the parachutes cannot go unmentioned. Cooper demanded 4 of them. He couldn't have taken all of them with him. Something must have been left in the cabin, so parachutes are a completely separate part of this story. Why? Because, firstly, based on which parachutes Cooper took with him, one can judge his background and degree of professionalism. Secondly, one can theoretically assume whether Cooper could have survived at all. The main parachute is the one on the back. The reserve is the one attached in front. Cooper was delivered 2 main and 2 reserve parachutes. The parachutes were prepared in haste, so one specialist prepared the main ones and another handled the reserves. Let's start with the main ones, because these are 2 different models for completely different tasks. These 2 parachutes are as different as a luxury car is from a tank. The first is intended for civilian jumps. It is much more comfortable and much more controllable. The second is a military model, far less comfortable and controllable. Which one did Cooper jump with? With the second. This automatically suggests that he had military experience and thus chose the second option. This version is partly confirmed by the model of the aircraft. According to the testimony of the airline employee who sold Cooper the ticket, he confirmed the model of the aircraft with her. "Will it be a Boeing 727?" he asked. The point is, this Boeing model, due to its design with the rear opening ramp, not only could pick up passengers from small airports, but was also used by the CIA for covert operations. They would open the rear ramp in the air and drop something or someone at a designated point. Another indication of Cooper's expertise and possible ties to intelligence services or the military. A good lead. It seems. This theory does not quite align with the reserve parachutes. The instructor who packed the reserve parachutes told the FBI that in haste he issued 1 non-functional parachute. It is simply a training dummy that could not deploy. Guess with which reserve parachute Cooper jumped? Precisely, the non-functional one. He cut the lines from the normal reserve parachute to try to tie the bag. How could a professional not notice that the reserve parachute was just a dummy? It is unclear. Another detail that undermines Cooper's expertise is his lack of knowledge on how to open the rear door of the Boeing. If you recall, he had to ask the flight attendant about it. This raises the logical question of whether Cooper could have survived at all if he made the jump in poor weather conditions in the dark, with a military main parachute and a non-functional reserve. An expert who worked with the FBI confidently stated that it was entirely possible if the main parachute operated normally. Moreover, Cooper did not need to be exceptionally experienced in this matter. 7 or 8 jumps would have been quite sufficient. However, it is very likely that he could have been injured during landing, since it's difficult to control the distance to the ground in the dark. Gathering all information about the parachutes, the FBI is checking all nearby hospitals for anyone who might have sought treatment for leg injuries. They are also investigating intelligence personnel who participated in covert operations involving the Boeing 727. In both cases, no one resembling Cooper was found. The main efforts of the FBI are concentrated in the eastern part of the country. Firstly, it is likely Cooper was familiar with the area. He boarded the plane in Portland and recognized the town of Tacoma from the airplane window. Jumping over familiar territory is also safer. Secondly, it's likely that witnesses might be found, perhaps those who saw Cooper before or after the jump. Investigators are going door to door in homes and offices. Hundreds of suspects are taken in for further questioning. A few days after the incident, the FBI distributed Cooper's portrait in newspapers. The list of potential suspects grows very quickly. Police officers, former prisoners, military personnel, workers, guards, amateur and professional parachutists, anyone who might know anything about airplanes and jumps. The chances that the hijacker used his own surname when buying the ticket are close to zero. However, investigators are carefully checking people with the surname Cooper, who somehow fit the description. And of course, the reports of eyewitnesses. Neighbours, colleagues, comrades in arms, friends and relatives of the potential Cooper. They write from various parts of the country claiming to personally know the hijacker and are ready to tell investigators everything. The FBI even conducts several arrests, but it quickly turns out they have nothing to do with Cooper. A few weeks after the airplane hijacking, no results are obtained. Neither Cooper, the money, the parachutes, nor any significant witness testimonies are found. However, there are letters sent to newspapers, handwritten, typed and composed from cut-out letters from magazines. In these, the sender claims in one way or another that he is Cooper and that he survived. The FBI, even 50 years later, is convinced that all the letters are nothing more than fakes. We will return to the letters more than once. Currently, we are interested in one aspect of the content of some of these messages. There, the sender says he does not consider himself a modern-day Robin Hood. This is interesting because, as strange as it may sound, that is exactly how many Americans begin to perceive Cooper. Yes, he did not distribute the loot to the poor, but he, in a way, tricked the system and did it with a risk to his life. On the west coast of America, Cooper becomes a celebrity. Songs begin to be dedicated to him and themed parties are held. He took a risk, no one was hurt, and he vanished with $200,000. It reaches the point of absurdity where Cooper begins to be considered a hero, not only by many Americans but even some law enforcement officers. They hope that the hijacker will not be caught. D.B. Cooper ultimately becomes a legend. I deliberately mentioned a certain heroization of Cooper. This helps to understand the context, and the context may help to understand not only the reasons but also the motives behind the incident. What did Cooper mean when he said that he harbors no ill will towards the airline but simply feels anger? What drove him? How could a man with a bomb possibly board a plane so easily? How did he buy a ticket without a passport or any other identification? There are many questions. There is one answer: history. In the early 70s, everything in the world was different, including civil aviation. Airlines are still making great efforts to help us forget one simple fact. Somehow, a huge metal object flies at a great height, and you are sitting inside this metal object, with nothing depending on you. Well, in the 70s, the airlines tried even harder than they do today. Commercial flights, including those in the United States, were just developing. Companies attracted clients in every way they could. Passengers on board were served delicacies, allowed to smoke right in the cabin, and flight attendants were required to look good, not gain more than the allowed weight, and of course, be as attentive as possible to the passengers. What security measures were in place in airports at that time? In brief, none. Seriously. No metal detectors, no mandatory passenger screenings, no passports or identification required to purchase a ticket. Nobody wanted to scare off customers, even after a real hijacking epidemic began in the United States. 130 hijackings occurred in America. And I mean not in the entire history, not in half a century, or even in decades, in 4 years, from 1968 to 1972. Sometimes there were days when several hijackings happened at once. Many of these hijackers demanded to fly to Cuba. Since the early 60s, there was no air communication between the countries. Some hijackers were Cubans who wanted to return to their homeland. Others were Fidel sympathizing enthusiasts. Gradually, criminals began to realize that by hijacking a plane, they could fly not only to Cuba, but anywhere, and also demand money. And such a wave of hijackings began just at the very start of the 70s. And despite this, the airlines and authorities still did not want to implement the radical security measures we are all accustomed to today. By the end of 1971, when Cooper's hijacking occurred, there were only a couple of small innovations. Sometimes suspicious passengers could be searched at the airport, and on some flights, but not all, there could be an air marshal, a law enforcement officer dressed in civilian clothes, like an ordinary passenger. He was supposed to ensure security during the flight. Cooper was not searched, apparently. He did not arouse suspicion, and there was no air marshal on his flight. Serious security measures involving the baggage screening of all passengers in the United States would not be implemented for another 2 years. Was Cooper the main reason for this? No, but he certainly contributed to it. Speaking of the historical context, it is important to mention the following. The late 60s and early 70s were not only marked by the Vietnam War, but also by significant issues with the American economy. There were mass layoffs occurring, and leading in this regard was, notably, the Boeing Company. Most of the laid-off workers were employed at the company's production facility in Seattle, the city to which Cooper was originally flying and whose suburbs he observed from the airplane window. It is possible he was a former employee who was laid off, which would explain his anger. It sounds logical. However, investigators checked Boeing employees but did not find anyone among them who could have committed the hijacking. Moreover, Cooper did inquire about the model of the aircraft before purchasing the ticket, but that, in essence, does not mean much. Anyone who has flown at least a dozen times roughly understands the differences between various models of civilian aircraft. Additionally, Cooper did not know how to open the rear door, making it unlikely that he was a Boeing employee. And now it is time to talk about the first suspect, more precisely, the first serious suspect. As I mentioned, their total number reaches about 1,000, but we will talk about only a few. Those who, in one way or another, have the greatest chances of being identified as Cooper, April 1972. Less than 6 months have passed since Cooper's jump. A passenger named James Johnson boards a flight to Los Angeles. He's wearing glasses, holding a briefcase. Inside, according to James, is an explosive device. He's also armed with a grenade and a pistol. His demands include 4 parachutes and $500,000 in cash, the same type of aircraft. The hijacker also opens the rear door and jumps with the money during the night time. He successfully lands, stows the parachute and money in a ditch to return for them later. Then he calmly makes his way home and 2 days later, as if nothing happened, plans to go to work. The FBI arrests him at that point. It turns out the hijacker's real name is Richard McCoy. He used an alias when purchasing the ticket. In his house, all the money and the parachute are found. McCoy had jumped near his home in the state of Utah. Under local law, he faced the death penalty. Some FBI investigators were convinced that McCoy was Cooper, that he decided to carry out a new hijacking because he either wanted to earn more or lost the money, for instance, by dropping it during the jump. McCoy himself does not confirm any connection with the Cooper case. Moreover, he even denies involvement in the hijacking, after which he was found with $500,000. One way or another, McCoy might be considered lucky. Instead of the death penalty, he receives a 45-year prison sentence for the hijacking of the Boeing. Investigators do not find truly serious evidence linking him to Cooper. Over the course of several years, McCoy makes a couple of escape attempts from prison. During one of these attempts, he is killed by police officers. Richard McCoy remains one of the main contenders for Cooper's place to this day. For instance, one of the FBI investigators who continued working on the Cooper case in the early 2000s was convinced of this. Here are the arguments. The first and most obvious is that the plane hijacking operation itself is very similar in details. The same model of the aircraft, the same demands, parachutes and money. The hijacker conveyed his demands in written notes. He used the same escape method. McCoy used a wig, makeup, and an alias to conceal his true identity. Interestingly, Cooper might have used the same tactics. Moreover, Richard McCoy fought in Vietnam, receiving a medal, and importantly, he had jumped with parachutes on numerous occasions during his service. After retiring, he had health issues, constant migraines, and suspicions of a brain tumor. This brings to mind Cooper's phrase about harboring resentment. FBI agents also discovered that McCoy had used his bank card at a gas station in the Las Vegas area just a day after Cooper's plane hijacking. Yet McCoy himself denied being in Vegas at the time. If we only had these arguments, we might confidently assert that McCoy is Cooper. But it's not that simple. First, the physical description. In 1971, McCoy was only 29 years old, while Cooper, according to witnesses, was 45. McCoy also had blue eyes, whereas Cooper's were brown. The stewardesses did not identify McCoy from photographs. It is unlikely that he used such sophisticated makeup to change his eye colour and naturally age himself by 15 years. Secondly, Richard McCoy was a Mormon, and adherents of this religion do not smoke, while Cooper was actively smoking during the flight. Thirdly, McCoy was undoubtedly an experienced parachutist. Judging by Cooper's choice of parachutes and his behaviour, he was not necessarily experienced. In short, we cannot 100% confirm or deny McCoy's candidacy as Cooper. But what we can certainly say from this story is that jumping into the dark from a Boeing with a large bag of money and surviving is entirely possible. In general, the question of whether Cooper survived the jump is still debated. There is, of course, a theory that he never jumped, but instead exited the plane in the city of Reno after landing. However, this version is not supported by facts. The runway and the airport itself were searched immediately after landing by FBI personnel. Moreover, a month after the incident, investigators conducted a reenactment of Cooper's jump. They used an identical aircraft at the same altitude and threw a load out of the open rear door roughly corresponding in weight to Cooper's. Instruments recorded the same pressure drop and aircraft oscillations as during the alleged hijacker's jump. Many investigators who have spent half a century searching are confident that Cooper, of course, jumped and perished. There are reasons for this. The Boeing was moving at high speed. There was no visual contact with the ground since clouds were still lower than the low-flying Boeing, and it was dark outside. Most likely, after Cooper's jump, he was buffeted in various directions. It is possible that he could not even deploy his parachute, or perhaps he managed to deploy it but could not land safely, as the model of the military parachute did not allow for good control over the landing site. The terrain in the area is challenging, with many dense and impassable forests. And let's not forget, it was the end of November. Cooper only had a light suit and a raincoat. The version that Cooper perished after the jump has one weak point. Firstly, it makes the whole story less thrilling. Secondly, neither the body nor the parachute has been found to this day. In the year 1972, with the advent of spring and better weather, the search for Cooper in the area where the jump presumably occurred resumed. Once again, the military, using aviation, combed through the territory. They find a body as a result, but it quickly becomes clear that it belongs to a girl who was a victim of rape. A little later, new remains are found. This time they belong to a hunter who got lost in the woods. They even deploy a cutting-edge development of that time to search for Cooper. A secret reconnaissance plane equipped with a thermal sensor, infrared camera, and other advanced instruments. Theoretically, it could record the license plate of a car from an altitude of several kilometers. However, luck is not on the side due to the weather. Because of clouds, they failed to take any quality images of the territory in 3 sorties. Essentially, the active phase of Cooper's search concluded that same year. Further work with evidence, testimonies and documents leads nowhere. 40 years later, the FBI will declassify the case materials. It will turn out that a significant portion of them is essentially documentation of madness. Messages from people who are 100% sure they know the real Cooper and that he is their father, uncle, brother, or husband. It turns out the FBI was inundated with such messages. The statute of limitations for the hijacking of American aircraft is 5 years. That means in the mid-70s, the case either had to be closed or charges had to be brought against the criminal in absentia. Then the case could continue indefinitely. The court sides with the FBI, and the search for Cooper continues. However, it continues more on paper. In the mid-70s, no new evidence appears, nor serious witnesses or suspects. The case effectively stalled. Most of those who were somehow involved in the incident preferred to move on. The FBI had plenty of other work. Stewardess Tina Mucklow became a nun, and Florence Schaffner moved to the other end of the country and changed her name, largely out of fear, as she was the only one who saw Cooper without glasses. In the year 1980, on the riverbank, an 8-year-old boy is building a sandcastle. Unexpectedly, he finds a bundle of money, then 2 more. It quickly emerges that the serial numbers of the found bills match those given as ransom to the hijacker known as D.B. Cooper 10 years ago. As one of the investigators on the Cooper case said in the early 2000s, the finding of the money then was no less enigmatic a story than the hijacking itself and the disappearance of the culprit. And that's no exaggeration. A boy finds 3 bundles of banknotes in the sand. They are, of course, in poor condition, but that is not the main issue. The key point is that the serial numbers are legible, and they match the ransom of Cooper. However, the location where the money was found makes no sense. It is a sandy beach on the Columbia River called Tina Bar. The distance between this location and where Cooper supposedly landed is several tens of kilometers. How did the money end up here, and where is everything else? Altogether, 3 bundles were found. Originally, they contained $6,000, but several bills were missing, so the total was incomplete. Numerous theories have emerged in attempts to explain the location where the money was found. One principal theory is that the FBI incorrectly estimated Cooper's jump and landing site. After the document became accessible to journalists and enthusiasts of the case in the late 2000s, they discovered an intriguing detail. When investigators calculated Cooper's jump site, they overlooked 1 minute. Taking this into account, it appears that Cooper landed further away, in the Washougal River drainage area. A theory arose that Cooper may have fallen into the river and drowned. Part of the money, and he was swept into the ocean, with a few bundles being carried by the same current to Tina Bar, where they were discovered by a child 10 years later. It seems plausible, sort of. 3 separate bundles of money end up in the water and ultimately arrive at the same location. It doesn't quite add up. Moreover, in 2009, internet detectives conducted a special experiment. They threw 3 bundles of money into the water near Washougal and waited. The bills travelled only 100 meters in 3 months and were washed up on the shore. Thanks to further analysis, it became clear that the bundles of money likely didn't end up on Tina Bar by natural means. Apparently, someone buried them there. Here we refer to the results of 2 interesting experiments from the late 2000s. The first involves the rubber bands that hold the bundles together, the other, the banknotes themselves. When the money was found on the beach in 1980, the bundles were still held together by the original rubber bands. The rubber bands were not in perfect condition, but they still held the bills together. It turned out that these rubber bands contain a substance that deteriorates extremely poorly when in contact with oxygen. This means that when exposed to open air or water, the rubber bands disintegrate in less than a year. This indicates that the money was buried in the sand within a year of the hijacking, but not later. Another interesting analysis was conducted quite recently in 2020. A scientist who collaborated with the FBI on the Cooper case in the 2000s discovered traces of a specific type of blooming algae on the banknotes. The point is, these algae bloom only in spring, whereas Cooper's jump occurred in November, indicating that the money did not end up on the beach immediately, which further proves that they were not carried there by the natural current immediately after the jump. It turns out that someone buried the money on the beach. Who exactly it was is unclear, but it is possible it was Cooper himself, after the theory emerged that he could have landed in another area near Washougal. Many enthusiasts attempted to look for Cooper there, but neither his remains or traces of the parachute or other items were found. The story with the discovered money ultimately led nowhere. The FBI took the bills for analysis and found nothing substantial on them. They even refused to pay a reward to the family of the boy who found the money, citing the statute of limitations on the case. The family filed a lawsuit, and after 6 years of litigation, the FBI returned half of the amount to them. Some of these bills could hardly be called bills. In essence, they were merely fragments. And you have undoubtedly noticed that I often refer to research and experiments concerning the Cooper case that were conducted in the late 2000s. This is not coincidental. By the year 2007, the official investigation into the Cooper incident continued, but in practice, it had been at a standstill for decades. And frankly, it's not surprising. No one was killed, there was no damage, everything happened 40 years ago, and there are no new clues. FBI resources were directed towards new, more pressing matters. Cooper is so irrelevant that the agency doesn't even have the budget to send the money and other evidence for new analysis to its own laboratory. However, the case still has a responsible officer. This is an agent by the surname Carr, and he decides to act creatively. He grants access to the closed materials of the case at the time to several journalists and enthusiasts interested in the case. Some of these enthusiasts have access to powerful modern microscopes, and who knows, perhaps new, unexpected details will emerge. It is thanks to people obsessed with the Cooper story that many interesting studies of the evidence in the case have been conducted. The analyses of the last 15 years are interesting also because technology has advanced significantly. What can they say about evidence that is 40 years old? First and foremost, we are interested in the DNA test. If a sample can be extracted from Cooper's evidence, it would be possible to check many suspects and perhaps identify the hijacker. Experts managed to find a very small saliva sample on the tie. However, it turns out to be insufficient to conduct the necessary analysis. Okay, what about the cigarette butts? There, the amount of saliva should definitely be sufficient, but the cigarette butts turn out to be lost. After the initial inspection of the plane, immediately after landing, the cigarette butts went to the FBI branch in Las Vegas and subsequently disappeared. This means that the FBI retained the tie, parachute, tickets, and other evidence, but the cigarette butts were lost. However, it is worth noting that DNA was not used at the time, and the value of cigarette butts as evidence was considerably lower. They could simply have been lost, and why not? Another interesting investigation also pertains to Cooper's tie. Using a powerful microscope in the late 2000s, tiny particles of titanium were discovered there. In the early 70s, such material was extremely rare and was used only in specific industries for the construction of submarines, metallurgy, and aircraft building. What is so special about titanium? It performs excellently at high temperatures. This is especially important if you plan to build a supersonic passenger airplane. Boeing indeed had such a project, but in the end, the development was cancelled and all the workers were let go. This happened in the spring of the year 1971, 6 months before Cooper's hijacking of the airplane. Coincidence? There are just two things that are confusing. The FBI checked Boeing employees and couldn't find anyone. It's not a fact that the tie belonged to Cooper. Yes, most likely it was, since it was found in the same place where he sat. But this is not 100% proof. The official history of the investigation into the Cooper case ends in the year 2016. That year, the FBI suspended work on the case. They are ready to consider new valuable information if it appears, but active investigative actions by the agency itself are stopped. Does this mean that millions of people around the world stop being interested in the case then? Of course not. New suspects appear not only in the 70s, but they continue to appear even to this day. Each year, new documentaries and books on the subject are released. Most of them aim to prove that a particular person is the real Cooper. Authors spend years trying to find evidence. Many of these people are absolute fanatics about the case. The Cooper case has driven many insane. Seriously, one of these individuals has been wandering the forests where Cooper jumped for decades trying to find him. Another built a submarine to descend to the depths of Lake Merwin where he believes Cooper drowned. In the end, the dive nearly ended in the searcher's death. One journalist committed suicide after finding out that the person he suspected was definitely not Cooper. There is even a concept known as the Cooper curse, where the case literally consumes a person entirely. As I noted at the beginning, the more you delve into it, the more entangled it becomes. Many investigative authors have a tendency to focus on one suspect. In the end, they find a ton of evidence in favor of their theory, sometimes even quite compelling evidence, but completely ignore the arguments that don't fit their theory. So, let us move on to the most probable suspects, but let's try to look at them objectively. One we have already discussed, that was Richard McCoy. Let's consider him our suspect number one, not by importance, but simply in order. Candidate number two for being Cooper is Kenneth Christensen. His story as a suspect started quite late in the early 2000s. By that time, Kenneth was already dead. His 80-year-old brother appeared on television for a documentary about Cooper and realized that his brother Kenneth was Cooper. Yes, it sounds like the story of those eccentrics who overwhelmed the FBI with their speculations in the 70s, but here the case is truly interesting. Kenneth Christensen managed to participate in World War II. During his military service, he parachuted multiple times. Afterward, he worked as a steward for Northwest Airlines, and Kenneth's house was located about 30 kilometers from the Seattle airport where Cooper landed. In other words, the experience with parachuting is there, the knowledge of the aircraft is there, employment with the airline whose plane was hijacked is there, and the familiarity with the area is also there. And these are not all the coincidences. In the year 1971, Christensen was 45 years old, like Cooper, according to descriptions. Stewardess Florence Schaffner said that from the photos, Christensen looked very much like Cooper. Kenneth was also an avid smoker. Shortly before dying of cancer, he told his brother that he had some terrible secret. However, he never revealed the secret. After his death, relatives discovered a sum on Christensen's bank account roughly equal to $200,000. But as you already understand, there are quite significant arguments that undermine this rather plausible version. The first and most important is appearance. According to the memories of the stewardesses, Cooper had quite thick hair, while Christensen, on the contrary, had little hair. But he could have worn a wig. Also, Christensen was shorter than Cooper, according to the description. His military documents listed his height as approximately 175 centimeters, while Cooper was taller. The stewardesses would hardly have mistaken Cooper's height. Tina Mucklow herself was 175 centimeters. She could certainly have noticed whether Cooper was the same height or taller. And finally, the appearance of the money in the account was simply explained. Shortly before his death, Christensen sold a property. Our next candidate, suspect number 3, becomes Dwayne Webber. Everything began when, in the mid-90s, he said to his wife before dying, "I am Dan Cooper," and that he had $170,000 hidden, but he didn't say exactly where. Initially, not understanding who this was, his wife began her investigation. As a result, she not only learned who Dan Cooper was, but also found many arguments suggesting her husband was him. Dwayne Webber had military experience, including parachute jumps. During the investigation, his wife discovered that Dwayne Webber was not his real name. Moreover, her husband turned out to be a professional thief who had been incarcerated several times. At night, he supposedly ranted in his sleep about leaving fingerprints on the airplane's stairs. Moreover, they vacationed near Tina Bar Beach shortly before the money was found there. Visually, and by age, Webber also fit the profile. He was in his mid-40s in the early 70s. Weber's wife contacted the FBI several times, but each time she was told that the evidence was insufficient. The main problem with this suspect is that most of the evidence comes from his wife's words. Whether they are true or not, we do not know. Suspect number 4 is Barbara Dayton. Yes, you guessed correctly, this is a woman. But once upon a time, Barbara was a man named Bobby who later changed gender. So, Bobby Dayton loved flying. He wasn't a professional pilot, but an experienced amateur pilot. Shortly before her death, Barbara not only told acquaintances that she was Dan Cooper, but also described all the details of the incident, even those that were difficult to find in the press. Details like the bomb's construction, precise specifics of the jump, the wind conditions, how long she was in free fall, and so on. Moreover, she allegedly even left a clue as to where the money was buried. Journalists followed the clue but found no money. Additionally, Bobby Dayton's appearance did not match Cooper's. He had fair skin, light eyes, and a height of less than 180 centimeters, and height issues can't be fixed with makeup. Suspect number 5 is Robert Rackstraw. Let's start with the fact that it's thanks to this suspect that the FBI made the case materials public. Producer and director Tom Colbert was obsessed with the idea that Rackstraw is the real Cooper. Ultimately, he sued the FBI to release the materials, and his lawsuit was granted. In general, Robert Rackstraw resembles the hijacker. He has military experience, having been discharged from the armed forces for misconduct shortly before Cooper's hijacking. Rackstraw also had legal issues, even being accused of killing his own father, but later acquitted. Rackstraw himself, when asked if he was Cooper, would respond with something like, "If I were a detective, I'd suspect someone like me." He simply evaded the question. Furthermore, Tom Colbert's team took one of the letters claiming to be sent by Cooper to a newspaper and found an encrypted code that directly says, "I am Robert Rackstraw." But as you understand, this suspect also has imperfections. Firstly, at the time of the hijacking, he was 28 years old, not 45. It's unlikely that most witnesses would be so wrong in their age assessment of Cooper. Secondly, he had light hair and light eyes. Thirdly, using the same coding system employed by Colbert's team, it turns out that the letter also encrypts the name of a well-known cartoon character in SpongeBob. In other words, Rackstraw could be a suspect if not for the counter-arguments that completely refute the theory. And by the way, since I've mentioned Cooper's letters to newspapers, after the incident, various messages were sent to different American media, mainly local outlets on the West Coast. All of these share one commonality. "I am Dan Cooper and I survived." Some of these letters are just one sentence long, others span a whole page. Some are handwritten, others are typed or composed of magazine clippings. The FBI considers all the messages fake, and no evidence to the contrary has surfaced in 50 years. But one letter remains particularly interesting. The author writes that he planned the entire operation thoroughly, stating that he left no evidence, wore makeup and a wig, and claimed he was not a psychopath, but calm and calculating. He also notes that he has only 14 months to live. The final claim cannot be verified, but the assertion that the entire operation was well thought out sounds very questionable. The theory that Cooper was a professional parachutist or a professional pilot who meticulously planned the hijacking and executed it masterfully was popular for a long time. That's why it was important for us to examine in detail what happened on the plane. After all, this shows that Cooper was far from a cold-blooded expert. He took a dummy instead of a reserve parachute, used a more risky army parachute, and did not specify the denomination of the banknotes he wanted for the ransom. Had he requested $50 or $100 bills, it would have been much easier to jump. He did not demand special equipment with the ransom, and it's doubtful he had it with him. Perhaps there was something in that mysterious bag noticed by one of the passengers, but that's not certain. For example, Richard McCoy jumped in a specialized parachute suit. Cooper didn't know how to open the rear door of a Boeing. He didn't know there wasn't enough fuel to fly to Mexico and did not have a precise route. Therefore, it's likely he was quite a desperate amateur who had parachuted before, but clearly wasn't a professional. He just got lucky, at least until the moment of the jump. What happened next, we do not know. And in general, at this point, one might confidently agree with the FBI and say that Cooper crashed. But neither the body, nor the parachute, nor the money have been found to this day. And the money that was found suggests that Cooper survived. And if so, then there is another interesting version which I specifically saved for the end. Meet Dan Cooper, the comic book hero, a courageous Canadian Air Force pilot. He performs complex secret operations, including expertly parachuting. It's logical to assume that the character was named after the famous hijacker, but in fact, it was the other way around. The comic book began publishing in the 50s in French. The important thing is that by the year 1971, the comic was not published in America or in English, so Cooper could well have taken on the pseudonym of this character. Witnesses did not mention the hijacker having an accent, but some residents of Canada are absolute bilinguals, speaking both French and English without a pronounced accent. The FBI even attempted to collaborate with Canadians on the case in the 70s and requested information, but at that time, relations between the countries were not at their best, and the Canadian side naturally refused to cooperate, considering that the information partially concerned the military. Also, among Cooper's demands on the plane was a strange phrase. He asked for the money in current American currency. It's unlikely an American would specify that the currency should be American. In short, if Cooper survived, it is possible that he went to Canada and somehow managed to use the money there. Or he stayed in the United States and continued going to work as if nothing had happened. Interestingly enough, there have been no reports of a missing person resembling Cooper for decades. Surely he wasn't living as a hermit in the woods before the hijacking. The legend of Cooper is endless, simply because human nature craves a story. Based on the scant facts about the case, everyone can imagine their own version of Cooper, what he did before the hijacking, what happened after, and what kind of person he was. In the year 1971, Cooper was in his mid-40s, so if he survived, he would be 100 years old today. Theoretically, he could have lived to that age. But Cooper smoked 8 cigarettes during the short flight. Living to 100 is not his story.